Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Hall of Philosophy. My name remains, as it was this morning, Jeff Follansbee, and I think nobody's told me differently that I still serve as the Chief Executive Officer of the Chautauqua Foundation. As you certainly know by now, but it is important to say once again, this series of our Chautauqua's work on applied ethics is a collaboration between the institution and the David and Joan Lincoln family that focuses our program resources on contemporary problems and applied ethics. And I would ask you for one last time this summer to join me in thanking David, Joan, and Katie for their 18 years of investment in this program. Dr. Adriana Sanford is the incoming Lincoln Professor of Global Business Ethics at Arizona State University. A specialist in compliance issues arising in multinational businesses, Dr. Sanford is also a clinical associate professor in management at ASU's W.P. Carey School of Business. With 2 decades of experience working in international business and corporate law, she has served as primary U.S. counsel to several foreign multinational businesses. She has also lent her expertise to radio, serving as executive director and co-host of the Beyond the Curve show, a radio show about international law and international business that is broadcast through NBC's Phoenix affiliate. An ASU alumna, Dr. Sanford also has a JD from the University of Notre Dame Law School and a dual LLM from Georgetown University's Law Center. The topic of her presentation this afternoon is privacy, ethics, and money, money, money. Please join me in welcoming Adriana to Chautauqua.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to actually have it. I think it's a little bit easier. I wanted to thank David Lincoln and the Lincoln family and everyone here. I have really enjoyed my week here and have taken several notes so that hopefully I won't be repeating everything you've already heard, and I will be able to weave through the different topics. My area of expertise, for the last 20 years, I was in-house counsel and I was international corporate attorney for several different organizations. From there, I started teaching. One of the reasons I started to teach is I realized that our executives many times don't have the tools they need. The world is changing, we're becoming more and more global, and our executives are not ready, they're not prepared. My area of expertise is money laundering, tax evasion, counterfeiting, international white-collar enforcement. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to stick with our topic, which is data protection, and look at basically from a global perspective what's going on. It's going to give you some comfort because we're not alone in this, and you will be able to see how the laws of other countries will affect us. They'll affect us next year. So it's actually a very good talk. And to the extent possible, I will weave a little bit of some of the other topics in, to the extent I can provide you some guidance as to how to protect yourselves. So let's get started. Oh, and I am a weekly expert on Money Radio, and it's actually the largest financial news station in the country. And what I've done is I put those on YouTube. So to the extent you want to learn, they're free. To the extent you want to learn about money laundering, tax evasion, counterfeiting, or any other area, they're about 7 minutes each, and it gives you an overview. It's a good thing. So I was approached by NPR a couple weeks ago, and you all know about Target, Michaels, Neiman Marcus. And we know that we have hacks out there. We know we're concerned about our financial information. All of a sudden, we heard about AT&T and P.F. Chang. So I got a call, and they asked me if I would speak on how we could protect ourselves, our financial information. They wanted me to talk about the smart card, the chips. And I said, okay, well, I can talk about the smart card, I can talk about the chip, but really that's not the way we protect ourselves. that will cover us, that will protect us only if we have, obviously, the magnetic strip. We can change the chip. The chip cannot be counterfeited. But to the extent we're online, we still have a problem. And I said, we need to take a step back. Let's not talk about the chip. Let's talk about reform. The EU has a data protection directive. A directive means that it's not binding. The directive was written in the mid-1990s. I think it was 1995. The purpose of the directive was to give us some guidelines with regards to the internet. Now we know since 1995 a lot has changed. Well, as a result of Snowden, the EU decided to take new steps. And they're coming out with an EU data protection regulation. The regulation is binding. It's going to be binding on 28 countries. Well, what does this mean to you? Well, the directive, I'll first explain to you what the directive says, and then I'll explain to you the differences and how this is going to impact you. The directive out there, and what we have to talk about money, okay? So, our US multinationals right now, if they're doing business in the EU, they need to comply with certain regulations. Depending on which country you're dealing with, if you're dealing with Germany, Germany is very strict, okay? Very strict with regards to data protection. The UK is not as strict, but each one of these countries has taken that directive, and with their national laws, they've created guidelines for our companies. Now, let's say I have employees that are in France, in Spain, and in Germany. I can have interns, or I can be working in those countries. I can be selling my product in those countries. I can have a subsidiary, I can have a branch. Right now, the authority, there is a data protection authority in each one of those countries, and if there is a breach, I need to notify France, I need to notify Spain, I need to notify Germany. Well, if I'm in-house counsel, or if I deal with compliance, I need to be aware of how these laws are different, and what I need to do for each one of them. It's mosaic, it's a mosaic structure, a mosaic framework. Costs us money. Costs us money if we don't comply. The penalties are large, depending on which country you're dealing with. Okay, let's take a look at the United States. United States is even more complicated. Why is it that all of a sudden we knew about Target, but we didn't hear immediately about the others? Well, it depends on what state you're in. This is run by state law, not federal. We need federal guidelines. So depending on the state, it could be 2 weeks, it could be a month. Some say, depends on how many employees you have. Others say, it depends, we'll give you time to investigate. So what does that mean for you and I? Well, the hackers that have taken the information, the most crucial time is immediately after that so that we can get to the bank and we can tell them to cut it off. If we don't know, that's the time they're making the money. That hurts our banks. The banks were very upset when they learned that some of these hacks had happened and they could not notify. Because what does that mean? That means that each one of you guys is going to go to the bank, you're going to ask for a new card, plus anything on your statement that is not yours, you have a right not to have to pay that. And the bank eats that. The bank knows, they know this is a situation, they're okay with that, but what they're not okay with is the length of time that they're going to have to eat because no one has been notified. So that's the US, that's the situation we're in right now. Now with regards to the EU, we're dealing with the EU, we know that there are different laws in different countries. We know this is expensive for us, we know that if we're actually an executive dealing with this, you got to be on top of it. What's the new regulation going to be like, and how's it going to affect us? The new regulation coming out is still being debated. What the UK wants is different, obviously, than what Germany wants. Germany doesn't want to go backwards. The UK is concerned because if it's too strict, it may affect Google, it may affect Yahoo, and a lot of their companies. So they're in the process right now, but I'm going to tell you what's out there, okay? Don't hold me to this is what it's going to be because we don't know yet. We were hoping this was going to come out this year. Now it looks like this will come out at the end of next year. Okay? So you can Google it, you can go with it on the news and follow it. But basically, some of the good points here, I don't want to get too far behind from my slides because I will take you off in a different direction. Okay, some of the issues that we're looking at is they're going to require multinationals to have a data protection officer. If you have 250 employees or more, you need a data protection officer. That sounds like a great idea. Most companies, some companies in other countries have them. Most of our companies here have something in compliance, but not necessarily a data protection officer. What does this mean? Well, to our universities, it means we're going to start training our students in that direction. It means jobs. What does it mean for companies? They need to start thinking ahead. They need to start thinking about this. Are our companies actually looking at this? Are they looking at the EU reform? How much is the UK preparing? Some of the countries are more advanced than others. I've talked to Chile, I've talked to a lot of people in Chile. They're actually right now working on that. The number one country in Latin America, as far as being on top of what the EU is doing, is actually Argentina. I hate to admit. Other changes, notice. This notice that we're talking about that they give you a week, a month, we want to change it in the EU to 24 hours. So what happens if the people in the EU are notified in 24 hours? There's something called the groundswell. Facebook, news, you guys will all know within 24 hours if you've been hacked. So it's going to affect you in a good way, in a positive way. If they need to notify over there in 24 hours, we're going to know over here. So this is a good thing. Now, this regulation that's coming out is going to be a lot broader. It's not only for those companies that have subsidiaries and branches, it's for any company, okay, that is working or dealing with EU citizens by giving goods and services over the internet or by monitoring their behavior. So it is a lot more expansive, and it will touch a lot of our companies. We can go, I'll give you a few more, but let's back up and let's look at ethics before we go further. I'm going to give you also the big perspective of why the EU, obviously we know reform, needs to be had, and we know that Stone had something to do with this, but I'm going to also back up later and explain to you why the EU needs to be on top of all of this, why they want to continue being the leader. But first, let's talk about ethics. The way that ethics has been taught up to now, a lot of times it's been in the philosophy department. And you tell individuals, don't do this, do what's right. Well, we started to see a shift. We started to see that this was actually going into the business school. There was also a shift in the way it was taught. And people talked about, well, who should teach it? Should it be somebody who focuses on ethics, an ethics professor? Or should it be somebody who focuses on finance, marketing, accounting, and a small component of their class is going to be ethics? Or should we have somebody from the real world teach it? Because there's so many different approaches. And what's in theory is not necessarily what you're going to use in practice. So different schools, you will find different individuals teaching different techniques, and depending on the department you're in. I happen to have 6 years of law and have focused on compliance 20 years, and I've been practicing, so I am a pretty good match for this. Not only that, I've had quite a bit of experiences. One of the other reasons I stopped practicing and I started to teach is you get to a point where you see enough of it and you want to talk about it rather than continue seeing it. It's not pretty out there. We live in a wonderful place here, and a lot of times when you're dealing with money launderers, when you're dealing with terrorist financing, it gets pretty bad, which is the reason we need to protect our executives. We need to protect them when they're out there. We need to show them the way. We need to tell them when they're young. I don't like talking to my business team and finding out what's going on and then having to deal with it. I prefer to deal with my MBA students and say, heads up, don't be the scapegoat. Don't follow that herd mentality. Too often, our young executives, our students, are so excited about the promotion, or they're so excited about working for a certain company. They may not know exactly what they're doing, but they take the job. And what I caution them to do is if you're going to take that job and you don't know what you're doing, get some training. I'm not telling you don't take it, but be careful. Be careful, you never know who you're dealing with. Get some training, don't do the herd mentality. I know in the past, if you didn't know what you were doing, you jumped in and everybody around you helped you. The problem is today, you don't necessarily know who's next to you and whether you can trust them. And even if you're in a good company, guess what? They're bad divisions. There are rotten apples. That's why you have in-house counsel. We clean that up. So, one of the jobs I had, I was the assistant general counsel of a trade finance bank. 85% of what we did was trade finance with Latin America. The bank was clean. Everything was short-term revolving. Within 3 months, it was gone, it was out the door. We were publicly traded. It was a great job, 3 years there. But I noticed something was odd. As the assistant general counsel, there's only so much you can do. If your bank is clean, I had a quality control unit. I actually would train my lenders. And at the time I was at Georgetown, so I wrote a paper on the need of predictability for promissory notes for Latin America. Every single country was different, and I would have lenders that would bring me a note in Spanish that they had used in Brazil, in Guatemala, in Argentina. Well, great. In Brazil, you can collect in 5 months. You just used it in Guatemala, it's going to take us 5 years to collect. What I had been doing up to there, every single time I got something from a lender, from a borrower, and it was a little off, I would say, okay, well, this loan requires a stamp from the Ministry of Guatemala. The lender would go off, and he'd come back an hour later and he'd say, oh, here's a stamp from the Ministry of Guatemala. And I'd be like, okay, great. I'd grab it, I'd say, we're not lending. And he'd be like, what are you doing? And I'm like, that stamp takes usually a week. So I would write, and I wouldn't give it back to him because he'd be like, oh, let me have it then. I'm like, no, I'm keeping it because if some other person brings it to me, I want to remember why I didn't lend. So I would write, stamp came back too soon. Different little issues, different little things. I had no idea, but I had an archive of like 2.5 years of loans that I did not provide. When the regulators found it, they put it together. And what they found was that my chairman had received, I'm sure most of you know who Noriega is, in Panama. He went to jail. When he went to jail, he gave my chairman his money, and the drug deals continued. It was really nasty. Hamilton Bank, if you want to look it up. He got more. He got more than Enron. He's still in jail. CFO, president, they all went to jail. So what does this mean? This means no matter how good you are at your job, you never know who is above. And you have to know what you're doing. You can't rely on anyone else. Your gut will tell you what to do many times. And you have to follow that. You can't be naive. You have to be aware of what's out there. And too many times we know about Adelphia, we know about Enron, we know about WorldCom, but we don't know the specifics of why they went down. And if we don't know the specifics, we may end up in the same situation. So anyway, that's ethics, and that's the way I teach ethics. I look at it from, I'm not going to tell you to behave, do good. I'm going to tell you, if you don't do good, you may end up in jail. And actually, that is one of the biggest fears that we have, that our executives have today, the simultaneous prosecutions. It's no longer just bribery. You know, like some of these banks that have issues in Mexico, their foreign sub is bribing. Well, as a result of the bribery, all of a sudden, they're not going to put that in the book, so you have tax evasion. So their sentences are now compounded. So let's get back to EU data protection. The attitude we have in the United States is basically, if I want to get something online, if I want to get a product, if I want to get a service, I have no alternative other than to disclose my personal information. We do so on Facebook, giving photographs, giving names. We do so when we shop online. We give our emails, we give our addresses, a whole bunch of information. We also do when we go to Target. So the question is, how much of this information do we need to give? Why are we so complacent? We need to know who's getting the information, what they're using it for. Is it to market to us? Maybe that's something I don't mind. Maybe I want to be told when the latest such and such is coming out. But I also want to be told when they're selling my information. This is something with the EU. The EU is going to have a heck of a lot more control on this. And these companies are not going to be able to be taking your information, sharing your information. So if I have a company, let's say, well, I'm not going to name a company, let's say ABC Company. And ABC Company has hired 2 people right here for their company, and you're from France and you're from Spain. The way I handle your information is going to obviously be different than the way I handle everybody else's in this company, even if you're in the United States, because you are EU citizens. Let's say there's an investigation. I can't take their information without speaking to France and Spain, or whatever countries those are. Well, that's going to change. We're going to have one stop shop with a new regulation, one location for everyone. So I don't know if it's going to be France that's going to govern all of you guys, or if it's going to be Germany, even though you guys are from different things, but I'm going to have one stop shop under the new regulation, which is going to make my life a heck of a lot easier as a GC, as the person in compliance. I'm going to be able to go to you and say, this is what I need. There's an investigation going on. I'm going to need this, 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 and I can only use that information for that purpose. The EU authority will then tell me, okay, this is the way it's supposed to work. Well, what's happening right now with Microsoft? Microsoft, and Verizon for that matter, are having some issues. Because in the US, Microsoft is being told that the government, the US government, wants certain emails, wants certain data that is being stored in Ireland. That new regulation is not in place, but what we do know is in place is that directive. And Microsoft is saying, if I give you that without you going through the proper procedures, I'm not going to be able to I'm going to have fines, penalties, and I won't be able to continue with my business. This is going to cost me money. These are some of the issues that we are dealing with today. This is why we need to look at this from a global perspective. Our companies are actually starting to get into conflict of laws. And we have to be careful with what we request, or we're not going to be able to be doing business in certain places, and that's going to hurt our companies. Verizon is no longer representing the German government. They've been banned. Why? Germany's concerned. It's concerned that the US, the NSA, can be looking into their stuff. We have Apple, Verizon, Microsoft. I'm not sure, there's 2 more that have actually joined forces. If anybody knows the other 2, I forget. But they've joined forces, and they are trying right now to deal with the issue of these search warrants. They are not supposed to be extraterritorial. A search warrant is supposed to be for the US. However, the government, in certain circumstances, and I can't tell you the details on this one, requests their information in other parts of the world. That's one issue we really have to deal with, and soon. Another issue is we're talking about privacy. What about privacy with your lawyer? Attorney-client privilege. That's pretty serious. How strong is the attorney-client privilege today? What are the consequences of that? Well, I told you the EU was on the forefront of the data protection. The EU has been on the forefront of a lot of things. The Know Your Customer came from there. We use it. Also, when we were looking at 9/11 and terrorist financing, they came up with something called the Gatekeepers, I guess the term is called Gatekeepers Initiative, where they say, if you're an accountant, if you're a lawyer, you guys actually know a lot more and are closer to the fraud. You can actually mask it. You can actually help set it up. The money laundering can't be as... The money laundering, you can catch it a lot easier if you don't have lawyers and you don't have accountants involved, because people will mess up. But with a good lawyer, it's harder to detect. So as a result of that, some countries and the EU and certain, they've taken different pieces of it, but I will tell you what the Gatekeepers Initiative says. The Gatekeepers Initiative says, if you are in-house and you are senior and you know that there is money laundering going on, it doesn't matter that it happened 10 years ago. It doesn't matter that you just started. You are senior, you're a lawyer or an accountant. You must disclose this to the government if it has not been taken care of. And you know that sometimes companies push things under the rug. If not, you go to jail. So what happens? Your own personal life is changed. You're between a rock and a hard place. You don't disclose it, and the company's not doing anything, you go to jail. You do disclose it, because what are you supposed to do in the US? I'm supposed to tell you, don't do that, you've done wrong, and I leave. I terminate my relationship. Depending on what state you're in, because every state is different. Some say, well, if you suspect the fraud, you can go a little bit further, but this is state regulated, it's not federal. And the problem is, we're mobile. You started off in Vermont, and now you're in California. You were in Maine, now you're in Florida. And you've got a multi-jurisdictional practice. So you are working in Brazil, you're working in Argentina, you're working in Colombia and France. So you have to comply with the laws of all those countries because you're a senior executive, you're a GC. The GC is really the one that's in a difficult situation because they've got the bar and we don't want to get disbarred. So there is another conflict. Do we know it exists? Absolutely. Does the ABA know it exists? Absolutely. What's being done? That's a problem. They're not acting fast enough. They're being more reactive than proactive. No multinational has complained yet, but it's there. It puts attorneys in a very difficult situation. It puts you in a difficult situation. Because you don't need to live in Panama, or you don't need to live in France. But if you're an American citizen and you happen to have a house in France and you're doing business over there and you and I are working together, France is now involved. So you can start to see how this may affect you and how our need to look globally is very, very important. It will help us, it will protect us, and also we need to deal with these conflicts for our companies and for our executives. So here's my question to you. How would you deal with this? Who do you go to? Do you report it? Do you go up the chain to the ombudsman? What if the ombudsman is involved? What if many reports have been made to the ombudsman and nobody's done anything? Let's say it's money laundering and it deals with the government. Who in the government do you go to? What if you go to the wrong person? It's not like in the United States. You know, people get shot, depending on what country you're in, and if you're going to somebody and you're going to say, excuse me, but look what I found, you want to make sure that that person's not involved. So anybody, I'd like to hear. And look what happened. This is why, okay.
He's not pushing daisies, though. He's still around.
Do what Snowden did is the answer. What do you do when you're put between a rock and a hard place and you're told by one government that you must disclose something, and yet you're told by another government that if you do, you can be banned, attorney-client privilege. And the other country is saying you can go to jail. You've got your reputation, and you've got your freedom. What he said is do what Snowden did. Anybody else?
Yeah, if you do the right thing, and you do report something that's going on dishonestly, then many times you become a whistleblower, right?
Right.
And then you become a pariah in the firm, lose your job, and all sorts of things, unfortunately.
Exactly. What she said is if you do this, you become a whistleblower, and then you are blacklisted, basically. Whistleblowers don't always choose to be whistleblowers. There are people put in difficult situations. Yes?
So, but there are financial rewards for whistleblowers in the United States. The firm I was recently in won a huge amount of money through a wrong use of a pharmaceutical claim. So if you are part of the litigation for the whistleblower, you could make a lot of money for yourself.
Okay, what he's saying is he's talking about the Dodd-Frank legislation. Before we had Sarbanes-Oxley, whistleblower protection, not really, didn't do that much. But guess what happened? The DOJ and the SEC basically said a lot of their cases, a lot of the cases on corruption don't come from the multinational, they come from the whistleblower. The government is interested in catching the money launderers, in catching the corruption. So Dodd-Frank legislation came out. Dodd-Frank legislation has a whole bunch of different things, but in it, one of the things it has is the bounty for whistleblowers. It actually provides money. And we won't get into all the details, you guys can Google this. This is a good thing, but the problem is it's just money. And if you're dealing with a country that's corrupt or where there's danger, and that whistleblower happens to be in that country, it can be their life. It's not only bullying, it's not only blacklisting, it's not only losing your job. There's no protection for them physically. But that's good. Yes. And now everybody's comments are good. Those are good too. So.
There were 3 employees of the NSA who went up the chain of command and reported to the ombudsman within the NSA of what was going on. And they were brought up on charges. And the one who was the director is now selling at Apple's Genius Bar. He was ruined.
Right.
Trying to defend himself.
So what we're hearing is we need laws. We need a way so that people don't feel forced to be whistleblowers. It's not a situation that you want, and it's a scary position to be in.
You become a professor at ASU.
You become a professor, you teach. I like that one.
Aren't you protected if you find out about a client who is doing ongoing criminal activity from attorney-client privilege?
I'm sorry, repeat the question. Are you protected as a lawyer or as a client?
As a lawyer, if you report ongoing criminal activity, do you find out about it from your client? Or do you have to...
You are definitely protected in those other countries. In this country, if it's ongoing and it's pulling you in, technically what they say you're supposed to do is say bad, don't do that, and you're supposed to terminate the relationship. But depending, there's some states that say if you suspect it, it's ongoing, it's okay. But not every state says the same thing, and it's complicated. It's not an easy answer. So I don't want to say do this because then somebody's going to do it and Talk to your ethics counsel. I will tell you what my recommendation is after I hear a few more.
So as a young MBA potentially joining the company, might be wise to find out if they have an ethics policy or ethics counsel or whatever you said, and also make your own sense of ethics so they know that if they're hiring you, you're going to perform right.
That's very good. After I scare my students a little bit, I get questions and they say, how do we avoid this? And my comment is, you tell them you took this class and it was your favorite class. Guaranteed they won't put you in a bad department.
But so the practice continues. Putting a kid in a non-invasive or not threatening department means the practice within the corporation really continues.
Yes, there will always be bad apples. Companies, not everybody does everything perfect. There are people like the person I told you, my boss, who's corrupt. Not everybody wants to do right. You can't change that. The only thing you can change is give the individual the chance to understand what they're feeling and to report it to somebody. Talk, think about it. Don't become the scapegoat, because I didn't know what I had. It was a tip of the iceberg that I was keeping here. But what I tell my students is, if you feel something, don't go forward. Be aware. That's all I can do is protect them. If you are concerned, tell someone. That's my advice if you're put in this position between a rock and a hard place. The best advice I can give to you is your job is you're the general counsel of a company. You do international corporate law. You don't deal with this. What do? The same thing anybody else does. You find an attorney that practices in that area. And then you proceed according to what they're telling you. Then you're protected because you're following your attorney's advice. You're not acting on your own. Yes?
Yeah, but if you're the country, you're then more apt to shoot you and ask questions later. How do you find the individuals that you can trust that are going to help you?
If you are in another country and you're by yourself, how do you find someone that can help you? It's a very good question. Let's say you're junior. Let's say you've just gotten this awesome internship and it's in the tax department and you're being told to do something and you don't know what you're doing and you don't trust the people around you. That's when I tell my students, you go back to your professors. You seek help elsewhere. Your family, your professors, other people. 20 years. And I hope my students have that relationship with me. I'm like, I hope you continue to talk to me and I can continue to help you. It doesn't end here. I just hope I never get a call saying, I'm in trouble. But I might. Yes?
Can you help me understand why the 2007 bank fiascos and what caused almost the whole country to collapse, not one banker or financial executive was prosecuted, went to jail?
Well, what's interesting, okay, why in 2007 with the whole fiasco, not one banker, so many people escaped and did not go to jail? What's interesting is, how did this all happen? How did these scandals happen when we had regulators, when we had so many people looking? How did Bernie Madoff happen? Reason being, people are not educated in this area to catch it. People don't have the sixth sense to say this is wrong. Back then, a lot of people were naive. If you talked about fraud, they were like, oh, really? Today, if I say, hey, this might be going on, when I hear from somebody, something's happening, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm sure it's true. And they're like, no, seriously. I'm like, yeah, I know. So, I can't answer that. All I can tell you is that the DOJ, back in 2008, had about 300 cases. The backlog was huge, not enough money. I don't even know how many of those cases they got through. And sometimes they want to work with the governments too, the companies. If a company goes, and this is what I always tell my companies, if there's an issue, It's not your fault. If you had a bad apple that caused a bad situation in your department, you go to the government and you say, oh my gosh, look what's happened. The government wants the economy to continue. They want the company to do well. They will work with you. The problem is when you hide it and you sweep it under the rug and then you have to come back to the company. Or the problem is when you cut your compliance because you weren't doing well and the corners you cut were compliance and you didn't catch it for 6 or 7 years and then you got to go to the government.
So I remember reading something. Didn't recently some bank get fined like $8 billion? I think it was French bank, I don't think it was bank in the States.
And they do get fined here. Right. Didn't a foreign bank get fined here? Yes. $8 billion. And we have, what was it, JP Morgan is investing now $2 billion in their compliance? Something that I recommend for companies, for multinationals, in order to save money. In the United States, we have our government. The way it's scheduled, the way it's set up is checks and balances. We have our judicial, right? We have the legislative, and we have the court. And the executive, the checks and balances. Why don't we do this with our companies? Why are we putting all the burden on this GC that has to deal with Gatekeepers Initiative? Well, guess what? The DOJ and the SEC, when Pfizer had an issue, I think it was, the very first thing that the DOJ said is separate your compliance person from your general counsel. Why? Their functions are different. The GC is there to protect the company, and he's going to do everything to fight for that company. The compliance guy is there to detect, to find what's wrong, to protect the shareholder, to protect the consumers. So, in this country, other countries you don't necessarily need this, but in this country you do. You separate the CECO, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, now reports directly to either the board or sits at the management table, as does the GC. What I argue is let's give this Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer more international white-collar enforcement so that he can detect as well. And guess what? He's not subject to the bar. So it makes it easier. You take the pressure off of this general counsel that is subject to this, and then, you know what? Okay, so we have one angle, let's get the other one. HR. When you have a whistleblower, now that we have Dodd-Frank and we have whistleblowers, who does that whistleblower go to? The person they met in HR when they first started. They go back to that person and they say, oh my gosh, things have changed. How's your job? Things are bad. Well, the HR person doesn't know what they're dealing with. If you've got the whistleblower going to the HR, and that HR is a domestic person, they won't know what they have and it blows up later. So, IHRM, International Human Resource Management, is new. It's in its infancy, and schools are only now starting to get it going. IHRM, the International Human Resource Management Manager, is somebody who has a background in law, international law, corruption. Some companies even outsource the regular HR. And they have the IHRM that deals with expatriates, making sure that they are okay. It deals with issues of war. If all of a sudden you're in a country with your family and they're at war and you don't want to be there anymore, I have to move you and your family and transition you. What do we do sometimes? We'll take you and we'll put you over. If I don't have another branch or subsidiary out there, I might put you with a supplier so that you're now working there. It's great for us, for our business, until things are better. IHRM is very good also when you're dealing with a big supply chain. We love collaboration. Collaboration is awesome everywhere, except for when we're dealing with supply chain. Why? It concerns us. Data protection. So what did we as multinationals do? We said, we'll be on top of this. We're not only going to make sure that we have everything in place, maybe we even hire a data protection officer. We're going to check our top 25 supply chain companies and make sure they're in compliance as well. We're going to check what they're doing with our information before we collaborate. Well, guess what? The hackers know this. They don't go to your top 25 suppliers. They go to the ones that are off the radar, the ones you forgot about. This is what we're talking about. So we have to be ahead of everyone else.
Glass-Steagall was 38 pages, and Dodd-Frank is over 2,000 pages. Glass-Steagall worked very well until it was repealed, and Dodd-Frank was written by administrators in Washington who have a vested interest in making these things as complicated as possible, because when they leave government service,
They have a job.
they have a fabulous job at tens of thousands of dollars an hour
Yes.
interpreting what they wrote.
Right.
How do we stop
How do you muster through? I don't know how you stop that. It's a very good point, and I wish I knew because I studied Glass-Steagall at Georgetown, and then it was gone. I studied Russian law in London, and then it was gone. So that's happened to me quite a bit. All I can advise is that there are some very good attorneys out there that all they do is this. There's also something called the International Enforcement Law Reporter, for those of you who love this subject and are passionate about it. The International Enforcement Law Reporter actually is a reporter that deals with all these issues and deals with all these, the laws of different countries and how different companies are going to react to these types of things. And so that's a good source. There's several others, but that's the one I usually go to. Yes? Is it time? Oh, so we have to ask questions. Well, we are kind of asking questions. Oh, I'm told to invite people up. Oh, but go ahead. You can do it from there.
What about the sanctions that the U.S. has established for, let's say, European banks dealing with Iran and so forth, and this big French bank? The Department of Justice went after BNP Paribas or something, and they started out at $14 billion as a fine. Now they're down to 80. What leverage do we have in that world? I mean, the French got mad because we did that.
Unfortunately, I am not behind those closed doors, so I don't know why things like this happen.
Would you like to be general counsel of that bank?
Yeah, no. These are the concerns that you have when you're out there, and you don't really know, you never know all the pieces to the puzzle. And it can be frustrating, especially if you're putting this together and all of a sudden, things change. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just curious. Of course, there's an awful lot of business that goes to China, and there's a lot of suspicion that there's a lot of corruption in China. Is there anything special about a multinational corporation that deals with China?
Well, the issue, I can tell you a few things that come to mind that are important, and to you as a crowd as a whole. A lot of companies are doing business with China because right now, the biggest concern they have is their intellectual property. It was the biggest concern that I had when we were working with China, because, and this is where you have to think, the balancing. If I'm going to take something to you that I've created, and I want you to replicate it, and it's cheaper if you replicate it, what am I risking if I'm giving it to you and you're in China and all of a sudden you're making something similar? If we're going to talk about China, we're going to get into counterfeiting. We're going to get into intellectual property. That's really what's hot. And if I'm going to talk about counterfeiting, which maybe we can talk a little bit about it, the issue with counterfeiting, and I'll make it relevant to privacy, is companies, we'll go back to when I was in high school, okay? When I was in high school, mom and pops would sell, you'd have the mom and pop basically counterfeiting, bringing the stuff up here, and you would find purses, your friends would have parties, and these purses in the trunks, and, we had Gucci watches, we had Gucci purses, and it was kind of fun. You got everything really cheap. Today, it's different. The counterfeiting that occurs today a lot of times is actually linked to terrorist financing. The way it happens is, and I'll tell you why this is also important for the companies, but first why it's important for you. When the product gets here, the Chinese are very good at making things, but they're not very good at distributing. And what we found is a lot of times the distributors are individuals in organized crime. Why? Because charities, they've been caught with the charities. Doesn't work anymore. Drugs, guess what? If you are caught with drugs, you're arrested and it's in the paper. If you're caught with counterfeiting, it's not in the paper because the companies don't want everyone to know about it. It's their information, they're keeping it private. Not in the paper, you're not arrested, the material is gone. So, and the markup is very good. So this is where white collar, this is where terrorism is going. Where do they go through? Well, in some of my positions, I actually piloted some raids, and I can tell you a lot of times it goes through the duty-free trade zones because they're not regulated as well. With the expansion of the Panama Canal, a lot of it was going down that way and then into Latin America. We have something called the tri-border region. It's a very dangerous area in Latin America. Google it later. The concern now for companies. I am a multinational. I sell you this product. 10 years ago, do I want you to know that this is being counterfeited somewhere else? No. Because if you know that, I may lose this whole market share. Because you might think that mine is counterfeit and you might not want to buy it. Well, guess what happens when you turn a blind eye? When you keep it to yourself, when you're secretive. The guy that's making this, his product looks pretty bad. It doesn't look like mine, right? So I don't care. It's part of doing business. This guy, do you think he's going to continue to make an average or less than average product? No, he's getting better and better and better. You're allowing it because you're not doing anything. All of a sudden, his product looks identical to mine. He's made it. So now, they're mixing them in the gray market. And when you go to a store, this just happened to us here. We had the largest counterfeit raid. It was chapstick. It was Vicks Vapor Rub. It was baby products. And it was sold in regular drugstores. It was sold in Florida, New Jersey, and I think New York. I'm not sure if New York was the third one. But in a regular drugstore, and you couldn't tell the difference. So it's dangerous because counterfeit is not generic. If it's a baby product, if it's something we're putting on our bodies, it can be very dangerous. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're touching. If it's a beer, our kids go to Mexico. I always tell my students, don't buy beer, cheap beer, off the beach. It may not be beer. It could be very dangerous. So what happened all of a sudden? Now this guy has a product that looks exactly like mine. Let's say it's cords. Let's say it's electrical cords. Do you really think he's going to continue calling it the same name as mine? No. He's going to change the name. So all of a sudden, he's taking your market. And they're saying, oh, you could buy this, or Joe's product is as good. So he's now taken your whole market. And guess what? Then he can say, that other product, I recall, was counterfeit. There's had some counterfeiting when his was bad. These are the types of things you have to tell your executives. Now, why? Let's say you don't own a multinational. You could really care less about that issue. You happen to be the office manager of a law firm. And you've just been told to buy the power cords for the office. And you Google, and you find a really good deal. A week later, everybody's computer goes down. Mm-hmm. Do you know how many attorneys you're going to have upset? Better yet, you're on a business team. And there is a little widget, something that you ran out of for a product. Or there's a deadline and you're not getting that widget in time. So what do? No worries, go on the internet. You find that piece that you need, it's cheaper, you're under budget, or you're getting it in time. No one knows. A few months later, there's a recall. And you find out that somebody did this. So it affects your bottom line. And this is what executives need to know. This is what employees need to know. Before you buy counterfeit, it does affect everyone. And if you're not the one that's in business, let's say you're buying pharmaceuticals. Do you know that there are doctors that tell you because of the cost of medications, it's better to go on the internet and buy products from Canada because it's cheaper? Well, you guys don't have an issue because you can just drive. But the rest of the United States, they actually get online. And they're looking, pharmacy, Canada. Guess what? That's not Canada. They write whatever they want on that, and then you get this product. Why is this a problem? First of all, it may not be the right it may not even be the right product. Secondly, it may not be the right dose. So this can really hurt you. Let's say that's not your issue. Let's say you're healthy. This is actually going on in a developing country. Do you care? Well, malaria, a lot of these diseases they have counterfeit products. And as a result of that, you have drug-resistant diseases. And that's going to affect all of us. When we see the companies are not doing what they have to do, let's say child labor. There are no laws. We have laws to protect intellectual property, but we don't have laws for children. And when these multinationals do whatever they want to do, the only thing we have is our ability as a consumer to say something or not to buy something. And with executives, I think today, because of the groundswell, because we all communicate, there's more responsibility and they're doing more. And the institutions are changing. Everybody is changing. The government is changing. And it's getting better. You know, I saw a lot of faces, over this week, and people were concerned. And we should be concerned. I love the fact that this is a place to think, to act, and to encourage. We need to see more of this. We need to see more of this in the United States, which is one of the reasons I have those videos. Because I think it shouldn't only be those that can go to college, or those that have time or have money for a higher education that should know how to protect themselves. Is that it?
Well,
thank you.
thanks very much. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to all of you as well for being here this week with the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics, and thanks to the generosity of David Lincoln and the Lincoln family in pulling this together. Next year, we're going to be spread throughout the program over the course of the summer rather than being concentrated in a single week. So I think you should be looking for the Lincoln Center in weeks 1, 3, 5, and 6, but potentially in some of the other weeks as well. And on top of that, my understanding is that there's going to be a signature Lincoln Ethics event every week throughout the season next year. So hopefully we'll have a lot of opportunities to engage Chautauquans more in the years to come. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy yourselves.